Get a job, they said. Work hard, they said. Show up on time. Stay out of trouble. Be responsible. Be productive. Contribute, and you'll be okay. That was the deal. At least that's what millions of Americans thought the deal was. Then something happened. People kept their side of the bargain. The bargain stopped keeping its side of the bargain. Today, millions of Americans are doing exactly what society told them to do. They're working, not a little, a lot. 40, 50, 60 hours. Some people are working two jobs. Some are driving rideshare after work. Some are delivering food after delivering themselves to a full-time employer all day. And somehow they are still staring at their bank account, wondering if the electric bill clears before payday. Because the problem isn't that Americans stop working. Americans are working. The problem is that work no longer guarantees what it used to. Not luxury, not wealth, not a yacht, not a vacation home. Stability. The thing that used to sit in the middle, a home, reliable transportation, a little savings, a little breathing room, the ability to survive one unexpected expense without your entire financial life turning into a controlled demolition. And that's the part nobody wants to talk about because we have built an entire culture around the idea that hard work creates security. So when security disappears, we blame the worker. You should have worked harder, budgeted better, made better choices, skipped the coffee, canceled Netflix, stopped buying avocado toast. Meanwhile, somebody is saying that while paying $6 for a dozen eggs. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most Americans aren't struggling because they're reckless. They're struggling because the math stopped working. And when the math stops working, eventually people stop believing in the promises. Because what do you call a system where people work full time and still can't afford housing? What do you call a system where people have health insurance and still can't afford health care? What do you call a system where a family does everything right and one car repair turns into a financial emergency? Whatever you call it, it isn't stability. And stability was supposed to be the whole point. Today, we're going to talk about what happened, how one job used to be enough, how work got disconnected from security, why basic existence keeps getting more expensive, and why millions of Americans feel like they're running faster every year just to stay in the same place. Because this isn't a story about laziness. This is not a story about entitlement. It is a story about a promise. And what happens when people realize the promise no longer matches reality? Let's begin. Welcome back to Hold 'em Accountable. I'm Derek Holder, retired Marine, political troublemaker, and somebody who has looked at grocery store prices recently and briefly considered starting a backyard chicken empire. Tonight, we are talking about work, not hustle culture, not grind set influencers screaming at you from the inside of a Lamborghini they rented for Instagram. Actual work, the kind millions of Americans do every single day. Factory work, office work, construction, teaching, healthcare, retail, warehouse shifts, driving trucks, serving food, running cash registers, keeping this entire country functioning while somehow still wondering if payday arrives before another bill does. And here's the thing. This episode is not really about the American dream. That phrase has become so overused that it practically sounds like a car commercial narrated by a bald eagle. This is about something smaller, something more basic, the American promise. The idea that if you worked full time, contributed to society, and played by the rules, you could build stability, not luxury, stability, a place to live, food in the fridge, transportation that hopefully starts in the morning, maybe enough left over to breathe occasionally. That was the expectation, not private jets, not crypto millions, just a decent life built through work. And for a long time, millions of Americans genuinely believed that promise was real because for many people, It was. Now, obviously, America was never perfect. Let's not pretend 1957 was some magical worker paradise where everybody skipped through fields carrying affordable refrigerators. A lot of Americans were excluded from prosperity. Women, Black Americans, minorities, people trapped outside systems that intentionally limited opportunity. That history matters. But even with those truths, there was still a broader expectation that work created traction, that a full time job meant forward movement. Today, a lot of Americans feel like they're sprinting on a treadmill bolted directly to inflation. Wages rise slowly, everything else rises aggressively: rent, utilities, insurance, healthcare, groceries, childcare. At some point, people stop asking how to get ahead, start asking whether surviving itself became a subscription service. And honestly, that feeling isn't irrational because the middle class didn't exactly disappear. It got hollowed out, converted into a financial balancing act where millions of people look stable from the outside while privately calculating whether they can survive one emergency room visit, one layoff, or one transmission failure. That kind of stress changes people. It changes families. It changes politics. It changes trust in institutions. Because when people work full time and still feel economically fragile, eventually they stop believing that the system is designed for them at all. And once that belief starts spreading, countries get restless. Now, to be clear, this episode is not anti business. Businesses matter, entrepreneurs matter, economic growth matters. Profit itself is not evil. The problem is imbalance, because over the last several decades, workers kept producing more, but the rewards stopped following them home. That disconnect became one of the defining economic stories of modern America, and a lot of people felt it long before politicians started talking about it on television. They felt it at the grocery store, at the gas pump, at the pharmacy, at the kitchen table. That is where economic reality becomes emotional reality. And once that happens, the numbers stop being abstract. They become personal. So tonight, we're going to break this all down. How one job used to create stability, how work became disconnected from security, and why the cost of existing keeps climbing, and what happens to a society when millions of people feel like hard work no longer guarantees a fighting chance. Because if work stops creating stability, people eventually start questioning the entire system around it. And honestly, they're starting to. Let's start with the history, because to understand why so many Americans feel stuck today, you have to understand the deal work used to represent in the first place. Before we go any further, let's get one thing out of the way. This is not a nostalgia episode. We are not doing the political version of back in my day, gas was a nickel and everybody respected their elders. No, history deserves more respect than that, because history is not about longing for the past. It's about understanding how we got here. And to understand why so many Americans feel economically stuck today, we have to understand something that sounds almost unbelievable to younger generation. There was a time when one job could actually create stability. Not for everyone, not equally, not perfectly, but broadly enough that it shaped the expectations of an entire country. After World War II, America entered into one of the most economically productive periods in its history. Factories expanded, infrastructure exploded, manufacturing boomed. The interstate system connected the country. Millions of veterans returned home and entered the workforce. Businesses grew. Workers grew with them. For a while, the relationship looked something like this. The economy grows. Workers become more productive. Workers share in the gains. Simple. And for decades, that equation largely held. If a company produced more, workers generally benefited. Maybe not equally, maybe not perfectly, but the connection existed. People could feel it. A factory worker could often support a family. A teacher could buy a home. A truck driver could build retirement. A veteran could come home, get a job, and reasonably expect to build a life. Again, not luxury, stability. That word keeps coming up because it matters. Nobody expected to become rich. Most people simply expected that work would create a foundation. And for many Americans, it did. Now, one of the biggest reasons this happened was organized labor. Unions were significantly stronger than they are today. And before anybody starts throwing things at the screen, let's keep this balanced. Unions weren't perfect. Some were corrupt. Some made mistakes. Some protected bad employees. All true. But unions also did something incredibly important. They gave workers leverage because one worker asking for a raise is a request. 10,000 workers asking for a raise is a negotiation. That difference matters a lot. During the middle decades of the 20th century, union membership was substantially higher than it is today. Pensions were more common. Employer provided benefits were stronger. Healthcare costs consumed a smaller percentage of household income. Housing was generally more affordable relative to wages. College costs were dramatically lower relative to income. The system wasn't perfect, but for many families, the math worked. That is the key. The math worked. That's what younger generations often struggle to explain to older generations. Because when someone says, I worked my way through college, that may be true. When someone says, I bought my first home at 25, that may be true. When someone says, I raised 3 kids on one income, that may be true. But those experiences happen inside a different economic environment, not a different universe, a different economy. And that distinction matters because people are often comparing work ethics across generations while ignoring the fact that the underlying math changed dramatically. Imagine 2 people running a marathon. One starts at mile marker 1. The other starts at mile marker 10. When the first runner says, why are you struggling? I ran the whole thing. Technically, true. Also missing some important context. That is how a lot of economic conversations sound today. The effort is real. The circumstances are different. And if we're going to be honest about economic reality, we have to talk about both. Because sometime around the 70s or the 80s, something started changing. Slowly at first, then faster. Workers kept becoming more productive. Companies kept becoming more profitable. The economy kept growing, but the connection between those things and worker stability started weakening. Quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. At first, the wages didn't stop growing. They just stopped keeping up. Benefits became less secure. Pensions began disappearing. Healthcare became more expensive. Housing started separating from income growth. College costs started accelerating. The old equation began breaking apart. And once that happened, the entire promise of work started changing. And that brings us to the central question of this entire episode. If America got richer, why do so many workers feel poorer? If productivity kept rising, why doesn't stability feel like it followed? If workers kept doing more, where did the rewards go? Because that's where this story turns. And honestly, this is the part that makes people angry. Not because it's complicated, because it's not. It's because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's talk about how we got here. This is the part of the show where the numbers start looking less like economics and more like a magic trick. Because somewhere over the last 50 years, America accomplished something remarkable. Workers became dramatically more productive. The economy became dramatically larger. Corporations became dramatically more profitable. Yet millions of workers ended up feeling less secure. That should not happen. At least not according to the original deal. Because think about what technology has done. A worker today can accomplish more in an hour than many workers could accomplish in a day 50 years ago. Computers, automation, software, logistics, communication, supply chains. Technology made nearly everything faster and more efficient. Productivity exploded. And for a while, workers benefited from that growth. Then something changed. The connection weakened. The rewards kept growing. They just started flowing somewhere else. Now, before somebody starts yelling at their screen, no, this is not a cartoon villain story. There wasn't a secret meeting where rich people gathered around a giant conference table and announced, Today we shall destroy the middle class. History is usually less dramatic, much more administrative. What happened was a series of decisions, business decisions, policy decisions, market decisions, each one rational on its own, together transformational. One of the biggest shifts was how corporations began defining success. For much of the 20th century, companies generally bounced multiple responsibilities: customers, employees, communities, shareholders. Then, beginning in the late 20th century, shareholder value increasingly became the dominant priority. Again, not evil, just a shift, but it changed incentives a lot. Because if your primary responsibility is maximizing shareholder returns, labor starts looking different. Workers become cost, benefits become cost, pensions and training become cost, and every cost becomes something executives are pressured to reduce. Now let's talk about pensions, because younger viewers may not fully appreciate what disappeared. For decades, many workers expected pensions: work for a company long enough, retire, receive a predictable retirement benefit. Not glamorous, not exciting, stable. There's that word again, stable. Today, many pensions have been replaced by 401ks and other defined contribution retirement plans where workers shoulder much more risk themselves. Markets go up? Great. Markets go down? Good luck. The risk moved, not disappeared, moved. And it largely moved onto the workers. Now, to be fair, that transition did not happen overnight. There were tax law changes, regulatory shifts, rising pension costs, changes in corporate strategy, and a series of decisions stretching across decades. Entire books have been written about it. And honestly, that topic probably deserves its own deep dive someday, because the story of how America moved from guaranteed pensions to hope your investments perform well is one of the most important economic stories most people have never heard. But for tonight, the important takeaway is simple. The responsibility for retirement increasingly shifted from employers to the employee. And that shift changed everything. Then healthcare got tied tighter and tighter to employment, which created a strange situation. People became dependent on jobs, not just for income, but for medical survival. Think about that. You're not just leaving a paycheck when you leave a job. You may be leaving healthcare access, prescription coverage, mental health treatment, specialists, entire support systems. That changes bargaining power dramatically because workers become less free to walk away. When workers lose leverage, employers gain it. That's economics 101. Now, to be fair, employer-based healthcare did not appear out of nowhere. The system largely grew out of wage controls during World War II. Tax policies, labor negotiations, and decades of political decisions that encouraged employers to provide health insurance as workplace benefit. Again, this wasn't one law or one president or one political party. It evolved over generations. And honestly, the story of how Americans ended up getting healthcare through their jobs instead of through some other system could easily be its own deep dive. In fact, it probably should be, because few systems have shaped modern economic life more than tying healthcare to employment. But for tonight, the important takeaway is simple. When healthcare became attached to your job, leaving a bad job became riskier. Losing a job became scarier, and workers became more dependent on employers for something far bigger than a paycheck. That changed the balance of power, and it changed dramatically. Because once workers depend on employers, not just for income, but for access to medical care, the relationship stops being purely economic. It becomes personal. And that changes everything. Then came housing. And this is where things start getting personal. Because for most families, housing is not just another expense. Housing is the expense. For decades, housing generally rose alongside incomes. Then, in many parts of America, housing costs began accelerating faster than wages. For decades, housing generally rose alongside incomes. Then, in many parts of America, housing costs began accelerating faster than wages. Suddenly, what used to be manageable became overwhelming. People weren't buying bigger homes. They weren't living more extravagantly. The fundamentals changed. And when housing eats a larger percentage of income, Everything else gets squeezed. Savings, retirement, vacations, emergency funds, breathing room, gone. Now, to be fair, housing did not become expensive because one bad decision. This story includes zoning laws, housing shortages, rising construction costs, interest rates, investor owned properties, population growth, local government policies, and about 100 other factors. There is no single villain, which is unfortunate because villains make television much easier. And honestly, housing affordable is again an entire season of hold them accountable all by itself. The reasons housing became so expensive deserve their own deep dive, maybe several. But for tonight, the important thing is housing costs rose faster than many workers' incomes. Once that happened, the entire financial equation started breaking down. Because when your largest expense grows faster than your paycheck, everything else starts feeling impossible. And that's where people start experiencing something their parents and grandparents often didn't. Full-time job that still didn't feel like enough. Not because they were failing, because the math was changing underneath them. Then came education. College costs surged. Student debt exploded. And entire generations entered adulthood already carrying financial weight, not because they failed, because they followed the advice they were given. Get educated, build skills, invest in your future. And for many people, that investment arrived with decades of debt attached to it. Now, to be fair, college didn't suddenly become expensive because one person flipped a switch. This story includes declining public investment, administrative growth, changing funding models, rising demand for degrees, student loan policies, competition between universities, and a long list of decisions made over several decades. Like housing, there isn't one villain. There is an entire ecosystem. And honestly, the story of how America turned higher education from a pathway to opportunity into something that often requires decades of repayment is absolutely worthy of its own deep dive. Probably more than one, because it affects everything: career choices, home ownership, family formation, retirement savings, even where people choose to live. But for tonight, the cost of preparing for the workforce rose dramatically, and many workers entered adulthood carrying debt before they earned their first full time paycheck. That changes the starting line a lot because it is much harder to build stability when you begin the race already owing money. That's what makes this issue so powerful. People did exactly what society told them to do: go to school, gain skills, become employable, work hard. Yet millions still found themselves financially stretched before their careers had fully begun. And when that happens at scale, it stops being a personal problem. It becomes an economic one. Then, just when workers thought they understood the rules, the nature of work itself started changing. Gig work, contract work, part-time work, temporary work, independent contractor classifications, flexible schedules, flexible benefits, flexible stability, flexible retirement, flexible healthcare. Funny how flexibility almost always seems to flow in one direction, because flexibility sounds great till you're the one absorbing all of the risk. And increasingly, workers became the shock absorbers of the economy. Business slows down, workers absorb it. Healthcare costs rise, workers absorb it. Housing costs rise, workers absorb it. Education costs rise, workers absorb it. Inflation rises. Guess what? Workers absorb it. At some point, people stop feeling like participants in this economy. They start feeling like the economy's crash cushion. This is where all those stories finally connect, because pensions, healthcare, housing, education, the changing nature of work may seem like separate issues, but they all point to the same thing. Risk moved, not disappeared, moved. And it moved downward. Think about it. A generation ago, many employers carried more retirement responsibility. Today, workers carry more of it. A generation ago, housing consumed a smaller share of income for many families. Today, workers absorbed more of that pressure. A generation ago, healthcare costs represented a smaller burden on household budgets. Today, workers absorb more of that risk. Generation ago, college was generally more affordable relative to income. Today's workers often begin adulthood carrying debt, different issues, same direction. The risk kept moving, and it kept moving toward individuals. And here's the thing, nobody announced this. There wasn't a press conference. No politician stood at a podium and said, "Good evening, America. We have decided that ordinary people will now absorb a much larger share of economic uncertainty." It happened gradually. One policy, one business decision, one market shift, one regulation, one cost transfer at a time. So slowly that most people never noticed it happening until one day they looked around and realized they were carrying burdens their parents and grandparents never expected to carry alone. Because today's worker is often expected to fund more of their own retirement, manage more of their own healthcare risks, absorb more housing costs, navigate more education debt, survive more job instability, and somehow still be told if you're struggling, you must be doing something wrong. That is where people get angry. And honestly, that anger makes sense because what we're really talking about is exposure to risk, exposure to uncertainty, exposure to financial shocks. When enough risk gets pushed onto individuals, eventually stability becomes fragile. Not because people became weaker, because the margin for error disappeared. Think about how many Americans are one major event away from financial distress, a layoff, a medical emergency, a transmission failure, a roof replacement, rent increase, childcare issue. One thing, not 10 things. One. That's not a sign of personal failure. That's a sign of a system where the safety margins have been getting thinner for decades. And here's where this becomes dangerous, not economically, politically, socially, emotionally, because people can survive hardship. Americans have always survived hardship. What breaks people is the feeling that the rules no longer make sense. What breaks people is doing everything they were told to do and still feeling stuck. Work hard, get educated, stay responsible, build a career, raise a family, save for retirement. Those aren't unreasonable expectations. They're the foundation of the American social contract. When millions of people begin questioning whether that contract still exists, countries get restless. Not because people want special treatment, because they want the deal they thought they signed up for. And that is the story of the last 50 years. Americans didn't stop working. They didn't stop contributing. They didn't stop trying. The economy kept growing. Productivity kept rising. Workers kept producing more, but the rewards stopped following them home. And once that happened, stability started becoming a luxury instead of an expectation. Which brings us to the part everyone feels, not retirement, not healthcare, not housing, not student loans, the everyday reality sitting on kitchen tables across America, the monthly bills, the grocery receipts, the insurance premiums, the cost of simply existing. Because if you want to understand why so many Americans feel like they're falling behind, that's where you find the answer. At this point, some people might be thinking, okay, Derek, I get it. Pensions changed, healthcare changed, housing changed, education changed. And that's true. But most Americans don't wake up every morning worrying about macroeconomic trends. They wake up worrying about bills because economic theory is interesting, but economic reality is what shows up in your mailbox. And that's what makes this moment different. For most of modern American history, people worried about getting ahead. Today, a lot of people are worried about staying even. That's a massive shift because the conversation used to be, how do I improve my life? Now the conversation sounds more like, how do I keep the wheels from falling off? That's not prosperity. That's maintenance. And the reason is simple. The cost of existing keeps rising, not luxury, not extravagance, existence. Let's start with groceries because groceries are where inflation becomes emotional. You don't need an economics degree to know something changed. You feel it. You walk into the store, buy the same things you've always bought, somehow spend $30 more than you expected, again and again and again. Americans aren't drowning because they're buying yachts. They're drowning because they bought eggs and milk and bread and cereal, somehow left the grocery store wondering whether bananas have become a luxury good. Now add housing. Whether you're renting or buying, housing has become the giant weight sitting on top of everything else. For many families, housing isn't just the biggest bill. It is the bill that determines whether every other bill gets paid. Because when housing consumes more and more of your income, everything else gets squeezed. Savings disappear. Emergency funds disappear. Retirement contributions and financial flexibility disappear. And suddenly, you're not planning for the future. You are negotiating with the present. Then comes healthcare. And here's the cruel part. Many Americans have health insurance. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They're insured and still can't afford healthcare. Think about how absurd that sentence is. You bought the thing designed to make healthcare affordable, and healthcare is still unaffordable. Deductibles, copays, out-of-pocket costs, prescription expenses, specialist visits, medical debt. People aren't avoiding care because they're irresponsible. Many are avoiding care because they can't absorb another financial hit. Then comes childcare. And if you've never had to pay for childcare, let me summarize it for you. Imagine discovering that a second mortgage can somehow fit inside of a daycare center. Parents across America are doing the math every month and realizing that one paycheck is often being consumed by the cost of allowing both parents to work. That isn't sustainable. That's survival accounting. Then comes utilities, electricity, water, natural gas, internet. And before somebody says, well, technically internet isn't a utility, try applying for a job without it. Try attending school without it. Try running a business without it. Try existing in a modern America without the internet. The reality is that many essentials of modern life are no longer optional. Every one of them has become more expensive. Then comes insurance, health, homeowners, auto, insurance for things you already own, insurance for things you're legally required to own, insurance for things you hope never happen. And every year, those costs seem determined to audition for the role of most aggressive line in your budget. And that's really the heart of the problem. It's not one expense, it's all of them at the same time. If groceries were up but housing wasn't, people could adapt. If housing was up but healthcare wasn't, people could adapt. If healthcare was up but childcare wasn't, people could adapt. The problem is the pressure is arriving from every direction simultaneously. And eventually people can wall, not because they're irresponsible, because math exists. Let's do a simple thought experiment. Imagine somebody in 1995 suddenly arriving in 2026. You explain housing, healthcare, childcare, education, utility, and insurance costs. Then you tell them wages did not keep pace with many of those increases. The first question wouldn't be, why are workers struggling? The first question would be, how are they not struggling more? And here's the part politicians often miss. People aren't asking for luxury. They're asking for breathing room. They're asking for one emergency not to become a crisis. They're asking for a full-time job to feel meaningful again. They're asking for stability. That word keeps coming back because that's what this episode is really about. Not wealth, not success, stability. The thing that used to sit between poverty and prosperity. The thing millions of Americans feel slipping further and further away. And when enough people start feeling that way, something changes. The conversation stops being economic. It becomes political because people begin asking questions. Who benefits? Who makes the decisions? Why does productivity keep rising while security keeps falling? Where is the money going? And that's where we get to the receipts. Because if we're going to talk about why work no longer feels like enough, we need to follow the numbers. And the numbers tell a story that is very difficult to ignore. Because feelings matter, stories matter, personal experience matter, but numbers have a nasty habit of ruining comfortable narratives. And tonight, The numbers are about to become extremely inconvenient because if you spent the last 20 years feeling like you're working harder but getting less, the data says you're not imagining it, not even a little. Let's start with the biggest number in the entire episode: worker productivity. The amount of economic output generated by American workers for decades after World War II, productivity and worker compensation generally move together. Workers produce more, workers earn more. Simple. Then around the 70s, those lines started separating. Workers kept becoming more productive, the economy kept growing, but compensation stopped keeping pace. The gap widened, then widened again, then widened some more. Think about what that means. The economy became more efficient, workers became more productive, the wealth was created. The question is, where did it go? Because it didn't disappear. Somebody got paid. Let's talk about housing, because housing is often the difference between stability and constant anxiety. For decades, home prices and incomes maintained a relationship that, while imperfect, generally allowed working families to enter the housing market. Today, that relationship looks like it needs couples counseling. In many areas, home prices have dramatically outpaced wage growth. Rents have surged, property values have surged, and younger generations increasingly face housing markets their parents would barely recognize. Here's the important part: people didn't suddenly start wanting castles. The target stayed mostly the same: a safe place to live. The price changed. Healthcare spending has risen dramatically over the past several decades. Premiums increase, deductibles increase, out of pocket costs increase, prescription costs increased. And because healthcare is tied so closely to employment, workers often find themselves trapped between financial security and medical security. And remember, this isn't luxury spending. Nobody is buying healthcare because it's fun. People buy healthcare because the alternative is significantly worse. Higher education costs increased dramatically over multiple decades. Public universities became more expensive. Student loan balances grew, and millions of workers entered adulthood carrying financial obligations before their careers had fully begun. Again, the issue isn't education itself. The issue is that workers increasingly paid more to become employable. That cost got shifted downward too. Now let's talk about the number that makes people throw things: CEO compensation. Because while workers were hearing, tighten your belts, do more with less, we all need a sacrifice, executive compensation often moved in a very different direction, up rapidly, sometimes spectacularly. Now, let's be clear: this isn't about whether executives deserve to make more. Most people accept that leadership positions pay more. The question is, how much more? Because at some point, the gap stops looking like incentive, starts looking like a different economic universe. This might be the most important receipt of them all. People aren't just worried about money, they're worried about security, emergency savings, retirement, medical emergencies, job loss, unexpected expenses. Millions of Americans feel economically vulnerable despite working full time. That feeling isn't coming from nowhere. It's being reinforced by reality, because when the margin for error disappears, security disappears with it. And that brings us to the most important conclusion of the night. The problem isn't that Americans stopped working. The problem isn't that Americans forgot how to budget. The problem isn't that everyone suddenly became irresponsible. The numbers don't support those stories. The numbers support a different story. Workers kept their side of the deal. The economy grew. Productivity grew. Technology improved. Corporate profits grew. But stability became harder to reach. Not impossible, harder. And when millions of people start feeling that reality at the same time, it stops being a personal problem. It becomes a national one. So what do we do about it? Because if the diagnosis is everything costs more and risk keeps moving downward, then the solution can't be good luck. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Because the goal isn't to make everyone rich. The goal is to make full-time work mean something again. Now comes the part where somebody asks, okay, Derek, you've spent the last hour explaining why everything costs more. What exactly are we supposed to do about it? Fair question. because diagnosing the problem is only half the job. Anyone can point at a house fire. The challenge is figuring out where the water is. So let's talk solutions, not fantasy, not utopia. Not every problem disappears by Tuesday. Real things, practical things, things that can actually move the needle. Let's start with the most important point of the entire episode. The goal isn't to make everyone rich. The goal is to make full-time work mean something again. That sounds simple, but it is actually a profound statement because somewhere along the way, we've started treating stability like a luxury. It isn't, or at least it shouldn't be. A full-time worker should have a fighting chance at building a stable life, not a guaranteed mansion, not guaranteed wealth, a fighting chance. That is the baseline. First, housing. Because if housing costs keep outrunning wages, everything else becomes harder. And unfortunately, there is no magic button. Housing shortages took decades to create. They won't disappear overnight, but we can build more housing. We can modernize zoning. We can encourage affordable development. We can reduce unnecessary barriers to construction. And we can stop treating every housing conversation like a blood feud between neighbors and planning commission. Because if working people cannot afford to live where they work, the system eventually breaks. It's already showing signs. Second, healthcare. Whatever your preferred solution is, and trust me, people have opinions. The current trajectory is unsustainable. Healthcare costs cannot continue growing faster than household stability forever. Eventually, something gives. Workers should not have to choose between medical care and financial survival. And employers should not be carrying the entire burden of America's healthcare system either. That's a debate for another episode. But pretending the status quo is working isn't serious. Not anymore. Third, workforce development. And no, I don't mean telling everybody to learn coding. That advice aged about as well as a Blockbuster membership. I mean apprenticeships, trade programs, technical education, career pathways that create good paying jobs without requiring decades of debt. America needs skilled workers, a lot of them, electricians, plumbers, HVAC techs, machinists, welders, healthcare professionals. The future workforce is not going to build itself. And when workers gain valuable skills, they gain leverage. Leverage matters. We've already talked about that. Fourth, wages. Let's be clear. This conversation is not about whether every job should make somebody wealthy. That's a straw man argument. The question is whether productivity gains should continue flowing almost entirely away from the people creating it because workers helped build this economy. They should benefit from it. That means competitive wages, strong labor protections, safe workplaces, fair scheduling, reasonable bargaining power. Whether that comes through unions, market pressure, labor shortages, or policy changes is a separate conversation. But workers need leverage. Without leverage, the conversation is over before it starts. Fifth, childcare. And if you have children, you already know why this belongs here. Childcare is not just a family issue. It's a workforce issue. When parents can't afford childcare, participation drops, careers stall, income growth slows, economic mobility suffers. This isn't complicated. A country that wants working families needs systems that make working families possible. Anything else is self-defeating. But honestly, all those solutions point towards something bigger, a cultural shift. Because for decades, we've treated every economic struggle as an individual problem. Can't afford housing? Personal problem. Medical debt? Personal problem. Student loans? Personal problem. Childcare costs? Personal problem. Wages stagnating? Personal problem. Eventually, we need to admit something. When millions of people experience the same problem simultaneously, it's probably not an individual failure. It's a systemic issue. That doesn't mean personal responsibility disappears. It means personal responsibility cannot carry the entire weight alone. And that distinction matters. The truth is that Americans are remarkably resilient. People adapt, they budget, they work overtime, they sacrifice, they figure things out. And the problem is that resilience is being treated as a substitute for reform. And those are not the same thing. Just because people survive a system doesn't mean the system is working. It means the people are strong. Those are very different conclusions. And that's why this conversation matters. because the goal isn't creating dependence. The goal is creating stability. The goal isn't eliminating work. The goal is making work meaningful again. The goal isn't guaranteeing outcomes. The goal is making sure effort still has a reasonable path for stability. That's what people are really asking for. And honestly, that's not a radical demand. That is the promise that built the middle class in the first place. And before we move on, I want to say something personal. If you've followed me for a while, none of what I talked about tonight should sound new. The importance of affordable healthcare, workforce development, strong public education, housing affordability, worker protections, making sure a full-time job actually creates a path to stability. These were issues I talked about when I ran for Congress. They're issues I talked about when I wasn't running for anything. And they're issues I'm talking about tonight, not because they're politically fashionable, because they are still unresolved. The facts haven't changed. The need hasn't changed. And frankly, neither have I. If anything, the numbers we've looked at tonight make these issues more urgent than they were when I first started talking about them. Because the goal has never been partisan victory. The goal has always been making sure ordinary people have a fair shot about building a stable life. That's it. That's the mission. It always has been. And with that, let's see what deserves a hold and what deserves a fold. Now, you know the rules. If it helps working people build stability, we hold them. If it makes life harder while pretending to be common sense, we fold them. Tonight, we're not folding people. We're folding ideas. Some of them very popular, some of them very profitable, and a few that should have been retired about the same time as dial-up internet. Let's begin. Every generation eventually develops a favorite hobby. For some, it's gardening. For some, it's fishing. For some, it's complaining about younger workers. Apparently, that's timeless because every few years somebody says, nobody wants to work anymore. Really? Then who's staffing the hospitals, driving the trucks, stocking the shelves, teaching the kids, building the houses, delivering your packages, making your coffee? Americans are working. Many are working multiple jobs. The problem isn't a shortage of work. The problem is a shortage of stability. Fold it. This one survives purely because it sounds clever. If people would just stop buying coffee, everything would be fine. Sure, and if I stop buying windshield wipers, maybe I can afford a yacht. Look, budgeting matters. Personal responsibility matters. I'm not dismissing that, but nobody is getting crushed by housing costs because they bought a sandwich. Nobody is carrying student debt because they ordered a cappuccino. And nobody is choosing between groceries and utilities because they enjoyed a birthday dinner. When major structural costs rise faster than wages, individual frugality can only do so much. Eventually, math wins. Fold it. This one should bother everybody. Republicans, Democrats, independents, everybody. If somebody is working full time and still cannot achieve basic stability, something is wrong. That doesn't automatically tell us what the solution is, but it absolutely tells us there is a problem because the entire premise of work is that it creates opportunity. When work no longer creates opportunity, the system starts losing legitimacy, not immediately, gradually, then all at once. Fold it hard. This one gets an enthusiastic hold. America desperately needs skilled workers, electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, welders, machinists, healthcare professionals. The future economy will need people who can build, repair, install, maintain, and solve problems. And many of those careers offer something increasingly rare, a pathway to stability without requiring mountains of student debt. That doesn't mean college is bad. It means multiple pathways matter. Hold it. Notice I didn't say make everyone rich. That's not the argument. The argument is simpler. If somebody works full time, there should be a realistic path towards stability, housing, food, transportation, basic security, a little breathing room. That shouldn't be controversial. That should be the floor. A society doesn't have to guarantee success, but it should make the effort worth something. Hold it. Throughout this entire episode, one word keeps appearing: leverage. The periods when workers did best economically often shared one thing: workers have leverage, sometimes through unions, sometimes through labor shortages, sometimes through market conditions. The mechanism can vary. The principle doesn't. When workers have no leverage, all the negotiating power flows in one direction. And when all the power flows in one direction long enough, stability starts disappearing. Workers need leverage. Businesses need flexibility. Both things can be true. Hold it. So tonight's scorecard. Fold the myth that Americans stop working. Fold the idea that coffee is causing economic instability. Fold a system where full-time work still leaves people falling behind. Hold apprenticeships and skilled trades. Hold meaningful wages. Hold worker leverage. Simple, responsible, and somehow incredibly controversial in modern politics. Funny how that works out. When I was growing up, there was an idea that sat at the center of American life. Not a law, not a policy, not even a political ideology, an understanding, a promise. You work, you contribute, you play by the rules. And over time, you build a life, not a perfect life, not a wealthy life, a stable life. Life where hard work creates traction. Life where effort matters. A life where tomorrow is a little better than today. That promise built communities. It built neighborhoods. It built the middle class. It built expectations that were passed from one generation to the next. Parents told it to their children. Teachers told it to their students. Veterans told it to their sons and daughters. Employers told it to workers. Politicians told it to voters. Work hard, you'll be okay. That's why this conversation matters, because millions of Americans are looking around and asking a question that gets louder every year. What happened to the deal? Not the American dream, the deal. The basic understanding that work creates stability, because people are still working. That is the part that drives me crazy, because people are still working. That is the part that drives me crazy. The people struggling are not sitting around waiting for someone else to solve their problems. They're working. They're driving trucks, teaching classrooms, stocking shelves, working construction sites, running cash registers, answering phones, serving food, protecting our communities, caring for patients, keeping this country moving one shift at a time. They're doing exactly what we were told to do. And too many of us feel like we're falling behind. And when that happens long enough, something dangerous begins to grow. Not anger, not at first, doubt. Doubt in institutions, doubt in leaders, doubt in systems, doubt in the future. Because people can survive hardship. Americans have survived hardship since the day this country was founded. We've survived wars, depressions, recessions, disasters. What people struggle to survive is confusion. The feeling that the rules no longer make sense. The feeling that the finish line keeps moving. The feeling that no matter how hard they run, the distance never gets shorter. That is what breaks trust, not hardship, meaninglessness. And let's be honest, somewhere along the way, we started treating stability like it was a luxury, something earned only by the lucky, the exceptional, the wealthy, the connected. No, stability is not a luxury. It is the foundation. A society cannot function if the people holding it together are constantly one emergency away from a crisis. A country cannot thrive when millions of people feel economically fragile despite doing everything they're supposed to do. And a democracy cannot remain healthy when citizens begin believing that effort no longer matters. Because once people stop believing effort matters, they start looking for someone to blame. And history teaches us that rarely ends well. Tonight, we talked about pensions, healthcare, housing, education, wages, childcare. But those aren't separate stories. They're chapters in the same story. The story of risk moving downward, the story of cost moving up, and the story of stability becoming harder to reach. The story of millions of Americans asking whether the promise they inherited still exists. And maybe that's where I'll leave this tonight. Not with policy proposal, not with a campaign slogan, not with partisan talking points, just a simple idea. A job should mean something. Not everything, but something. A full-time job should not guarantee wealth. It should not guarantee success. It should not guarantee happiness. Life doesn't work that way, but it should guarantee a fighting chance, a fighting chance to build a home, a fighting chance to raise a family, a fighting chance to retire with dignity, a fighting chance to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. That isn't radical. That isn't socialism. That isn't conservatism. That isn't progressivism. That's the foundation of the American promise, or at least it used to be. And if we've reached a point where working people can no longer count on that promise, then maybe the question isn't whether workers have changed. Maybe it's whether the system has, because workers are still showing up. The workers are still trying. The workers are still carrying this country on their backs every single day. The least we can do is make sure the math works, because when hard work stops creating stability, something bigger than the economy breaks. Trust breaks. Hope breaks. The future breaks. And once those things start breaking, the repair bill is far more expensive than anything we've talked about tonight. So remember this: a job should not guarantee wealth, but it should guarantee a fighting chance. And if it doesn't, then maybe it's time to hold the people who built the system accountable. So stay informed, ask questions, and as always, hold them accountable.